what I want to do is call up the first panel straight away. And the first panel is going to actually blow up and out some of what I showed you in terms of how the system evolved and how the transit system was shaped by and shaped the urban forum. And to moderate this panel, I'm going to turn it over to Tony Travers, who is distinguished for a lot of reasons. For me, one of the foremost is he is a professor at the London School of Economics, which is my alma mater, where I did my master's and doctoral degree. And he's got a team of folks, including Dave King from GSAPP, who some of you may know, who's in the planning department, to really look back at the history and try to explain to everybody in a little bit more detail how we got what we got in both cities. So I'll let Tony introduce the panel. Hopefully most of you can see, we thought this was the most intimate setting. They'll each be talking to you. Tony will ask some questions, and hopefully you guys will have a chance to ask questions. So if you do have some questions, to note them down, and there should be time at the end. Okay.
Okay, Kate, thank you very much. And the first question I'm going to ask is, we'll run this on for the hour that was originally expected into the coffee break, just to check that. Okay. Right, well, good morning, everybody, and especially those behind me here. I apologize to you. I'll try and turn around from time to time. I'm Tony Travers from the LSE, as Kate has said, and this session is an attempt to hear now a bit from New York as well as from London, and to open up a discussion first here on the platform, but then to open it out so that everybody else can have a say, or at least ask a question. We've already heard that London and New York are extremely similar in many ways. Population, as we've heard, extraordinarily on a similar trajectory upwards, currently at exactly 8.4 million in each city. Amazing coincidence in many ways. But also, of course, the economies of the two cities are amazingly similar. If you look at an analysis of the New York economy and then at the London economy, they are amazingly, in terms of the sectoral breakdown and the financial industry and so on, very, very similar. And of course, equally now, facing the challenge of having to recalibrate that dependency on finance and to expand, for example, new digital companies, in part, not only that, but to fill in some of the gap left by the expansion that won't take place in finance and banking that perhaps would have done in the past. But they're also different, and Isabel touched upon this. Each city has a mayor and boroughs, but that is such a misleading way of describing their similarities, it's worth just stopping there. 32 versus 5, 32 with power, 5 not with anything like as much power, and therefore the mayor in London, a less powerful figure than the New York mayor, but with a powerful transport authority, as we've heard, Transport for London, very different to the MTA and the state-run system for transportation here. There's no doubt the cities have been shaped by their transport systems, subway and the underground, as Kate said at the beginning, now celebrating its 150th year with all the benefits and disbenefits that that suggests in terms of age, and of course, the very large commuter rail network, the extensive commuter rail network in London, never to be ignored. And of course, we haven't yet heard from anybody, and we might, the complicated governance of that system. Britain tried to privatise its rail system and now has partly unprivatised it, and it's a very complicated subsequent arrangement. And so, I don't want to speak for much longer other than to say that the purpose of this session is to explore some of these issues. First, let's hear from New York basis, and then let's hear from London basis, and then we can sort of, by questioning, do some compare and contrast and begin to develop a bit of the question of how far it's possible for these great cities to learn from each other. And my panel consists of David King from Columbia University, Jeffrey Zupan from the Regional Plan Association, Nicky Gavron, former Mayor of London and Assembly Member, Deputy Mayor of London and Assembly Member, and Stephen Glaister here, who is from the RAC Foundation and Imperial College. And I'll ask each of them to speak for no more than 7 minutes. I've been told to be fierce with this, so no more than 7 minutes. And then we will have a bit of a discussion up here on the platform, then I'll open it out to the audience more generally. So, David, okay. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I'll speak up here. It's easier. Okay. Well, Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about a paper I worked on and part of some ongoing research on the co-development of transportation and land use. And the title of this panel is Recent History. I'm going to be actually looking at a little bit of old history with the original development of the subway system in New York. Now, one of the key things that we're looking at here is, does transportation follow development, or does development follow transportation? Or in the case of Queens, does the internet follow transportation and development and everything else? So these are images of Queens from from about 100 years ago. And you can see that on the left you have a developed area and a guy who's standing there waiting for the train to show up. And on the right you have a brand new set of tracks being put in, which is generally the way people conceive of a lot of transit development. Is it went in speculatively prior to the land development. Now in New York, that was a very difficult proposition, and if we look at the justifications for why there was business support and overall support for the subway system and the development of the subway system, land development was not a primary reason. There is a lot of business support for subway expansion to decentralize the employment. It was used as a technology to sprawl the city to a degree. That there's overcrowding in Lower Manhattan, and the subway was used. It was the state-of-the-art technology at the time, and the subway was used to decentralize Lower Manhattan so that that could be taken over by commercial interests. And that was how they got a lot of support. The 1916 zoning code regulated building heights and uses in parts of Manhattan, but importantly, in most of the outer boroughs, land use was largely unregulated. That you could do a lot without the zoning code constraining what you were doing. And then the system itself was built by private transit companies with concessions, and they were limited. They were publicly limited to a 5-cent fare, which was certainly a challenge. But they had to capture their value of the system and the value of their investment through a fare. Now there's potentially and almost certainly some side deals on real estate and other things like that were going on, but dominantly the transit companies had to make their money on a fare that was regulated by the state. Now, if we look at the subway mileage and the population, you can see that for the most part in the period of the 1910s, 20s, 30s, the subway mileage and the population was growing. Both were growing dramatically, and then both trailed off around 1950. In the 1940s, both the population and the subway miles peaked. Now, had the city or the subway companies continued to invest in the subway, it's not obvious that the population would have continued to go up, right? So we know that there is this tremendous external growth that was happening in the city of population and the economy in the 10s, 20s, 30s. But we don't know, had the city continued to invest in the subway, would that have continued because you had competition from the autos, and roads and other aspects. Now this is looking at population per square mile, and you can see the decentralization occurring here. You can see that the subway opened in 1904, and you can see that the blue line, which is the population density of Manhattan, started to decline substantially at the same time that Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, which are the other 3 boroughs that had subway access, were increasing. So as a decentralization tool, it worked quite well. And this is the way the subway looks now. And I want to focus on I want to keep an eye on the area of Lower Manhattan, which is on the left side, and that is the area where the subway grew the densest, where the system itself grew the densest, and what we think of as being the really transit-rich part of the city. And so these were the initial lines that were open in 1910, in 1920, 1930, 1940. 1950, 1960, and the lines that opened in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were opened by the city, or by the precursor to the MTA. So those are public lines, and you can see that the competition with these early lines, they wanted to preserve their ridership. So there wasn't a lot of interaction between the lines. There wasn't a lot of coordination of the system, and that really happened afterwards. But the density of the transit network and the coordination of the system allows for very high densities. of development. And so there's 4 factors that I've identified that influence the continued subway land use development. The city population peaked and then declined, and we've now reached and exceeded the peak of 1950, and we're expecting to add another 1 million people over the next 20 years or so. Interstate freeways, parkways, and road development. There's a lot of this that went on in New York, famously by Robert Moses, but this represented a competition with transit. The comprehensive zoning implemented in 1961 restricted many uses and restricted what developers could do. And then there was a public takeover of the transit system, which influenced the financing and the financing and investment in the system itself. Now, these are some to give you a sense as to how the system does influence development. These are looking at commercial square feet and residential square feet by lot for the distance from a subway station in 2009. And you can see that within 800 meters of a subway station, both the residential and the commercial density are substantially higher. That the subway definitely influences the amount of development that can occur. And then this was, just to give a sense as to some other thoughts about the potential growth of the subway, this was a proposal put out in 1920 for the expansion of the subway system. Most of the red lines are the lines that were never built. The black lines were built by 1920. There are some that were built, but for the most part, the red lines represent an unbuilt system. And we don't know what would have happened with the city had all this been built, but it certainly would be a lot different than we have now. It would have allowed for much more development in the outer boroughs. One of the things to keep in mind as we're talking about when we're talking about London and New York, the New York system is a much more hub and spoke system than the London system, where the London system is far more of a dense network, much like we have in Manhattan. And so the conclusions, well, the subways were built in low populated areas. It was really the external growth factors that were influencing the growth of the city. It wasn't that the city was investing in subways. The city was investing in subways while the city was growing tremendously. And so that affected where growth occurred within the city. But it's not, we can't make a claim that it caused the growth to occur in the city. New stations were opened in areas already developed because of financing pressures. Separated transit facilities meant that growth in autos did not particularly negatively affect the subway operations, unlike streetcars that were built by land developers in most other US cities. The autos the congestion of autos on the city streets didn't influence the subways moving forward because they weren't getting in the way. And then the last two parts that I've mentioned, they're built in part to decentralize residential populations, and it was the economic growth and the population growth, the external factors that really influenced the growth of the city. The subway influenced where that growth occurred. So as we're thinking about how this affects development in the future, it will affect the location of growth, but we have to think about the broader influences of growth that are affecting population and employment growth in the region. And I will leave it at that.
Okay, we'll move straight on. Though I must say, I do want to pick up a question of, to flag a question for you, David, which is who are the key lobby, what were the key lobby for these developments? I mean, in the past, but particularly for the more contemporary developments of public transport, subway in particular, but hold that question, let's let Jeffrey speak, but I'd like to find out more about that myself. Jeffrey.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by talking about the Mta Capital Program and its current situation, which is so central to the question of what's been happening in recent years and what's likely to happen in future years. Currently, the program is $28 billion, and it's short by $10 billion or perhaps more. This is happening because there's a decline in support from federal, state, and city sources. and even the revenues that are collected now are under attack. And this is an environment where we've been borrowing, and it's becoming untenable to borrow even more. That's the bad news. And under those circumstances, what might get sacrificed? Well, the choices are state of good repair, or replacement, a normal replacement of activities of the system. And that's a very risky thing and is less likely to happen because the reliability of the system depends upon doing that. Secondly, is the question of whether we upgrade and modernize our systems. Two examples of that are signals, which are outdated, in some cases 100 years old, and we are not replacing the signal system at a rate that is tenable. Basically, in 80 years, if we would only, at the rate we've been going recently, we would only replace half of the system in that time. And then the question of changing our fare collection media, namely the MetroCard, which is reaching its end of its useful life, and we're being left behind by cities throughout the world, major cities throughout the world, who are moving to second and third generation fare media. And then finally is the question of expansion, which brings us to the issue that we're talking about today and its relationship to development. And the answer is yes, that's what's likely to be sacrificed first. And in fact, New York has a 75-year tradition of doing that, of sacrificing expansion. What you may have gotten from Kate's presentation and indirectly from David's is that we don't expand anymore. And we haven't really expanded the system hardly at all since the 1930s, when we reached the maximum extent of the New York City subway system. It diminished since then, and we're beginning to do some things somewhat tentatively. But given the financial situation that we're in today, the hopes, unless we change that financial situation, the hopes of expansion and then linking those expansion plans to development opportunities, like you saw in the presentation about London, are going to be very unlikely. Up to this point, expansion and development in New York has been tied at the lip. We talk a lot about it, but we don't necessarily do very much about it. Let's go through some of the projects that we have been doing and its relationship to development. Second Avenue Subway is a project that was proposed in the 1920s. Hasn't opened yet, and when it does open in 2016, it'll only be 1/4 of what it was intended to be, only less than 2 miles in Upper Manhattan. There's a long history there. If you're interested in learning about that history, there's a website, a Wikipedia website on the Second Avenue Subway I found very good to trace what's been happening in the last 90 years, which is not enough. And the fact is that during the entire period, there wasn't really much discussion about trying to capture the value from development. Now, in fact, the original purpose of the Second Avenue Subway was to replace the Third Avenue L and the Second Avenue L. Well, those were torn down, and the Second Avenue Subway was not built. But the development that was intended to be served by it did happen. The zoning was changed in Midtown to commercial and Upper Manhattan to residential, much higher densities. So we got the travel, and we no longer had the elevated trains or a Second Avenue Subway to run over those lines. And at this point, there's not a lot of discussion. At this point, not a lot of discussion about what would happen with future phases and how it might be linked to development. That has to occur. This is just a picture of where that first phase is. I won't dwell on it for the time being. We'll move on. East Side Access is a project to bring the Long Island Railroad into the east side of Manhattan, and there's no funding linkage to the development in Manhattan or on Long Island of East Side Access. Again, it's a project that has a long history, not as long as the Second Avenue, and is now scheduled for completion in 2019. and its cost has risen by about 3 times over the last 15 years or so. There is some discussion about upzoning the Grand Central Terminal, which is where the line would connect into, and that might create some incremental pedestrian relief measures for the additional crowding that's likely to occur in the area. And that's in a situation where the development that is possible in 100 or more stations on Long Island that would be served by this project is great. But at this point, there's a lot of resistance locally, anti-density biases and home rule governance that makes it very difficult to be able to expect that there's going to be development and then to use that development to try to capture some of the value after the fact that we've spent $8.7 billion. So we will spend the money and not necessarily get the development unless there's changes in attitudes and in governance. That's what the project looks like. I won't dwell on that for now. New Jersey Transit's Midtown Direct project was a relatively inexpensive project in the mid-90s, and we did the analysis. I should say a student at Columbia University did the analysis, and eventually she did such a great analysis that she's now works at RPA at a high position. Juliet Michelson, some of you may know, did the analysis of what the property values would change for those places, those homes that were near the stations that were served by the Midtown Direct project, which created transit service directly into Penn Station. And it showed that the difference in, or the rise in housing values for those places that were within walking distance of the station were $190,000 more than places that were beyond 2 miles from the station. And that's generally in a high income area, but it shows the impact that you can have on property values. But again, none of that was captured. None of it was captured to pay for any portion of the $70 million. There are other New Jersey Transit projects that did not capture the value. There are 4 of them, and I won't go into the details there. So up to this point, it's pretty bleak. We're not making that link. The Flushing Line extension, extending the Flushing Line to the far west side of Manhattan to open that area to redevelopment is, in fact, being paid for by a transit increment financing, a version of tax increment financing that is to pay for the $2.1 billion project. But even that has been cut back. There were initially 2 stations, and now only 1 is being built to stay within budget, which negates some of the value of the project. This is a project unlike the ones that I've described before that took decades even to be thinking about. This is a project that will, from inception to opening, will be less than 10 years. This project is one that is not being built, is not on anyone's drawing board except at RPA right now. And previous speakers spoke about the fact that we have radial subway lines in New York. Well, those radial subway lines, if connected with in London, which might be called an orbital, or in New York or in London might also be called the overground. This is a right-of-way in place that now has a few freight trains a week running on them, which can be converted into a transit line that would connect all of these subway lines and connect most of the radial subway lines in New York City, and would create tremendous opportunities for interaction among neighborhoods in the outer boroughs of New York City. This is a project that RPA is first surfaced in its 3rd plan in 1996 and will continue on. So I think it's important to come back and ask ourselves, where is the MTA today as we think about expansion plans and development? Well, we've had, it's going to counting 5 CEOs in 5 years. MTA has no strategic plan to be able to inoculate itself from political forces. There's a lack of political support because New York State is really in control of the New York City subway system and the region system, and much of New York State is detached from New York City and the region and doesn't understand the importance of the transit to not only New York City and the metropolitan area, but the economy of the entire state. Our assets are aged. You saw that a lot of it is 80 or 90 years old, some of it more than 100. We're finding it difficult to get the resources. It was going to be more difficult to do expansion projects unless we find the resources. And we're depending on, as I say, on a political process that doesn't work for us. So we're going to leave behind, if we don't do anything about it, these modernization projects and expansion projects. And unless we can change the governance, we're going to be in a difficult situation. And so what must happen? We must find a broad-based source of funding. Congestion pricing is still a possibility, although people are very shy about it now since we were defeated, unlike in London. We can link funding to development. That can help pay for some of the activities, but that development doesn't occur unless we have the expansion. The expansion doesn't occur unless we have the funding. And so there are other things we can do. We start dealing with labor, strategic plans, fair policies, and begin to create some sort of coordination among the various transit agencies, not just the MTA. And so that the governance is more closely related to the people that are being served. We need to be thinking more directly about transit-oriented development. You'll hear more about that. We have to begin to talk about designs that are not anti-transit and pro-auto, if you will, and more walkable environments. We're doing a lot in New York City, and that's one place where the mayor does have some control. And we have to establish those value capture mechanisms and rethink that transit land use link. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeffrey. I mean, again, I'd like to come back. It's related to what I was going to ask David, but we'll come back to this when we open it out in a few minutes. You've raised the question of governance and the possibility of a consistent approach by government institutions over time, and clearly the lack of that. So I'd like to come back to the two of you on those questions. Our third speaker, now moving back to London, is Stephen Glaister.
Good morning. My job is to make 2 points about background and governance in London, and then talk a little bit more about the history of what happened in London, taking us up to around about 1990. And then my colleague, Nicky Gavron, would take the story on from 1990 to the present day. The first of my points about governance is that if there's one explanation of the differences between what's happened in London and in New York, it is simply the fact that national government in the UK is located slap in the middle of the London area. Of course, not the same as in New York. Add that to the fact that in the UK system, local government has very little control over its own money, as Isabel Dedring said. In other words, it has a very weak local tax base. The consequence of those two things together has been that since 1948, which was the date at which the rail provision was nationalised, almost all decisions of a major nature have been taken by central government, not by the local government. Most of the time, central government thinks it runs transport in London. And actually, most of the time, it is correct, because it has the power, it has the money. We don't have a big tax base locally in London, and so it's the Treasury that make the decisions. Nothing happens in terms of major capital decisions unless the Treasury approves it and provides a big chunk of the money. And in our system, the Chancellor of the Exchequer running the Treasury and the Prime Minister have a great deal of personal power. And that's really where the decisions get made these days. The second point of general background about London I would make is that London has got two rail systems and a very important bus system. It's not just the London Underground. It's a bad mistake to try and think about London only in terms of the London Underground. if you look at the magnitudes to give some scale to this, your average London resident on an average day will travel 1.1 miles on the Underground. He or she will travel 1.7 miles on the other rail network. That's the National Suburban Rail Network. And he or she will travel about 1 mile on the bus network. So those three are roughly the same order of magnitude. And in fact, there are twice as many trips on the bus network as there are on the Underground network. They're shorter, but twice as many of them. By the way, the biggest mechanized mode is the car. Your average Londoner will travel 4.8 miles by car, compared to the numbers I just gave. So don't go away with the idea that London is a public transport city. It isn't. The dominant mode is the car. There is dominance on the trip from the suburbs into the centre, but in the round, the car is by far the most important way of moving people around. And incidentally, for comparison, cycling is 0.013 miles. So it's in the roundings. It's just not in the big picture. National Rail, to be clear, has always been and remains under the control of central government. It's never been under control of the local authority. And National Rail is currently investing a lot of money in the London suburban network. It's increasing the capacity by 40% through various small programs like lengthening trains, lengthening platforms, improving signalling. So don't forget the crucial importance of National Rail. And of course, the proposal for a high-speed rail link, which will have big implications for London, as Isabel has mentioned, is, again, a national government scheme to spend a very great deal of money we haven't got on something to help very rich people travel very long distances. It's a decision of national government and not anything to do with what central government, local government in London would have powers over. So those are my 2 points. Government, national government, is in the centre of London, and you have to consider London in the round, both the 2 rail networks, the bus network, and the car network, to understand what's going on. Now, a word on the history, taking us up to 1990. It's up to 1948. It is very similar to the story we heard from David King on New York. Transport development was all about commercial development, a commercial competition for an existing market, and extending that market by building lines out into the rural areas. Those expansions were all about getting revenue from fares, not about capturing land values. They did have big implications, of course, for land use, but they were not about capturing land value for the commercial market. After 1948, which was a point where central government nationalized all the mechanized transport, the objectives changed from being commercial to being about 2 things: job creation and crowding relief on the system. The Victoria line was about, that's the line that runs from northeast to southwest, opened in 1969. It was about relief of crowding in central London on that alignment. The reason it was approved by central government was actually to do with job creation during a depressed time. So a lot of expansion of the underground network just after the war, that was also about job creation. So none of this was a policy driven by land use development or land use planning in any sense. Talking about the history briefly of the underground and the buses, in the 1920s and 30s, there was a lot of expansion of the underground commercially and a big growth in bus travel after the First World War. And there was a lot of competition which led to financial difficulty for the London Underground and a lot of profit for the buses. That led to the creation in 1933 of an integrated public trust, which was called the London Passenger Transport Board. The reason for it was to allow the buses to cross-subsidise the railway. And it was overall, didn't take money from the state at all. There wasn't subsidy in London until 1970. So from 1948 to 1970, we had the whole thing being run by central government. Then the Underground and the buses were given to the Greater London Council in 1970. Nothing much happened in the way of investment. The big story then was fares fair, when the mayor at the time, or the leader of the GLC, Ken Livingstone, because he didn't have control of the capital, did the one thing he could do, and suddenly and quite significantly reduced the fares on both the bus and the Underground. He had that decision reversed, very famously by the House of Lords, and fares had to increase very substantially. That led to the controversy that caused the government of the day, again, to nationalise both the buses and the tube to create London regional transport. So it was nationalised in 1948, it went to the GLC, the local government, in 1970, back into national control in 1984. The thing about London regional transport in 1984 was it was supposed to be a regional body. And I say this having been a board member from that time. The idea was that the new body would take control of all of this, take a regional perspective. It never did. What it did do was manage decline. We in 84 onwards didn't have the money to put the system in good condition, and we suffered very badly later. And it wasn't until 2000 when the new government did get the money from central government to mend the system. But what LRT did do was introduce bus tendering, one of the great triumphs of procurement. So the buses were privatised but procured under competitive tender, and they still are a great success. The Docklands Light Railway was built on a grant from central government to open up Docklands. That was an example of an investment to open up a piece of derelict land. Later there was extension of the DLR to bank and increase in capacity with the benefit of financial contributions from the developers out there. So it was the first time that there was big money coming to, from the developers to improve the system. And it responded in analysis terms to the big bang that happened in the late 80s under the Thatcher government. London boomed. There was severe congestion on the network, crowding on the network, which spawned the Central London Rail Study. The question there was, what are you going to do about crowding on the rail network? Published in 1989, it made 3 recommendations. Improve the existing system, get more capacity in the existing system, which we didn't do until 2000, but we have done it. Crossrail, 1989 this was, which we're doing now, and Crossrail 2, which is actually Hackney-Chelsea at the time, which we're still talking about. Those 3 decisions were approved at the time by the then government. I think Steve Norris may have been involved with that. Approval for Crossrail. It never happened. The money wasn't there. What did happen was a scheme which we now know as the Jubilee Line extension, which happened because of a deal done with Mrs. Thatcher, the Prime Minister, and the developers of the Canary Wharf area. It was very expensive, 4.4 billion, with a small contribution from the developers, and it was not on the map in terms of the plan at the time. So it was an example of how the private interests linked with political pressure got something done over and above what had been planned as part of the Central London Rail Study. And that really is the story up to 1990. Not much land use planning, all about capacity improvement, lack of money, but what was done as a result of central government and in particular pressure from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. I'm going to hand over now to Nicky Gavron and take the story on.
Thank you, Stephen.
I'm going to, I can't make this open, I'm going to talk as fast as I can and take the baton from Stephen and run to up to Isabel. In a sense, I'm doing a prequel to Isabel's absolutely excellent presentation. Now, I want to tell the story that's very rarely told, which is how the London Planning Advisory Committee, which was set up when the GLC was abolished, and you have to remember, I mean, Mrs. Thatcher, who died earlier this week, abolished the GLC. I mean, obviously breathtaking thing to do. That was London government. And LPAC was set up, and it played a central role in shaping integrated land use, transport and regeneration strategies from then onwards, strategies and policies which were carried over into London-wide government and into the transport strategy and the London plan, which is where I hope to end. LPAC was set up. It was it was just a kind of wheeze. It was set up by an amendment in the teeth of hostility to the act that abolished the GLC. It was set up in the Lords. And it was a joint committee of the 32 London boroughs and the city, and it was statutory. Its job was to advise government on strategic matters for London and the wider region. And the government ministers it advised were the Secretary of State for Transport, Environment, Planning, and later London Transport, and Minister, who's here in the audience, Stephen Norris, and the Minister for London. It also worked very closely with the London boroughs and with the rest of the South East. And it worked with the rest of the South East, and those counties are indicated. London is a centre of a functional urban region of 22 million. Its population then, we're talking about it being about 7 million. And it worked through the South East Regional Planning, Planning Association. And that was again made up of all the counties and of the London boroughs. Why was LPAC influential? Well, it had rubber teeth, it was advisory, so, you know, why should it be influential? But in fact, it had these 32 members from the London boroughs and one from the city on it, one from each borough, and we were cross-party, we were hung, we determined that we were going to be influential. And the only way to do that if you have no powers is to actually work cross-party. So we worked in the best interest of London, or tried to, highest common denominator, not lowest common factor. And we also worked cross-sector to achieve a very, you know, cross-sector, cross the London-wide stakeholders, and all of them, sorry, I've got to keep time down, but we worked across these sectors and stakeholders, and in the end achieved what I think is a very influential consensus, which of course was inherited by the Mayor of London in 2000. Now, what did it actually do? Well, it commissioned research studies. It was holistic, it was joined up, and if you're not part of the hurly-burly of party politics, which you weren't in a way on this indirectly elected body, you could actually think long-term. And what we did was commission a lot of research and produce integrated strategies. Now, I want to just pick up, I want to get on to land use transport, but I first want to pick up from Stephen and show the next slide. Now, this is something actually quite radical, which is we produced in 1996, and we'd been having lots of policy programs and working very closely with LT and working with the London Borough Associations, but we produced an integrated transport program. Now, this was integrating all modes, and they're set out there. So all the different modes, that had not been done before. And it was also not just integrating them, it came up with a single budget for them, and I can talk about that later, what that was. And it also went beyond that and said that all these modes had to be justified by common objectives, common criteria for prioritization. These include the proposals, and you can see the Jubilee line was under construction, and then it went on to include Crossrail, Crossrail 2, Thames Link, which still isn't there, of course. Anyway, now I just want to talk about an early accomplishment because I'm trying to link up with governance. London LPAC produced, with some very influential partners, a world city study in '92. I've just gone back a few years before this slide. And that in fact, showed London to be, compared it with New York and a few other cities, Tokyo, Berlin, Paris, showed London to be a world city at risk. A world city at risk because, although it was easy to get to, it was impossible to get around. And this was it was overcrowded, it was congested, a pollution. This was a complete wake-up call. First to business, who set up London First, which hope Kathy Wild's here, which is the nearest equivalent to the New York City Partnership. And secondly, and above all, to government, who then decided to have a transport minister for London, Steve Norris, who I'm very pleased is here. And a few years later, beefed up a government office for London and gave us a minister for London, who was John Gum, who was also Secretary of State for the Environment. Now, this gave us courage on LPAC. And I was leader of the majority party, well, no, the biggest party, later the majority party, and became chair. Gave us courage to produce, next slide please, in 94, strategic, I hope I got the right slide. Yep, strategic planning advice to government. Now, this set out the main structural features of London, town centres, areas of community regeneration, areas of opportunity, and it was all tied together with transport infrastructure. It set out a vision, a fourfold vision of a strong economy, a sustainable future, and it also set out the policies, laid the foundation for what, in fact, was being talked about to a certain extent by Isabel, which is you actually have a key objective, which is to make sure that you have mixed use, mixed income, higher density neighbourhoods co-located with a vastly expanded transport infrastructure. Now, and improved, of course, but expanded. And underneath that was one thing essential to land use planning and regeneration, which is that you have to wean people off the car onto bikes, bus, feet, and of course, rail. Now, this led us to our seminal work on congestion charging and the traffic reduction strategy, but more of that perhaps in conversation. This is the deprivation map of London. Now, I want to talk about the work we did on mapping areas of opportunity and areas of community regeneration with the deprivation map, and then linking the transport to that. We argued the case for regeneration being mainly in East London to rebalance the economy. The port had left East London and also had manufacturing, and the new port was in the west. It was the airport. But it left, in fact, a whole swathe of communities without any economic raison d'etre, and, of course, swathes of brownfield land. So huge opportunities and huge need. The next slide, please. This shows, I hope, it shows, yes, it's LPAC's, this is updated for a bit later, but it shows the concentration of deprivation and in the east and those areas of regeneration. Now, we adopted the East Thames corridor. Now, I guess has a long history, can't tell you all about that, but in fact, Mrs. Thatcher concentrated on Docklands, but Heseltine concentrated, a government minister of hers, and of course almost her nemesis, concentrated on the East Thames corridor. Peter Hall, the famous Peter Hall, worked with her, and we adopted that, and we adopted it, and later it was turned into Thames Gateway. Now, big things we argued for. We argued for new lines, new stations, and linking people to jobs, and also as a spur to development. The first one we argued for was the North Greenwich station on the Jubilee line. There would not have been a station on the south unless LPAC had argued for that. We also argued for East London line and the DLR to go across. We argued for the South Bank to be related to the North Bank, Bexley and Greenwich, so the joining up of the whole East Thames Gateway. And we argued for Crossrail, next slide please, which I hope is Crossrail. Crossrail, and we said we wouldn't support Crossrail unless it went to the Isle of Dogs, Canary Wharf, and on to the regeneration areas south of the river, Abbey Wood, and we'll hear lots more about that later. And this shows the big development sites. We called it LPAC's Kite, which were going to be opened up by all that there. And the last thing we argued for was the Channel Tunnel rail link. Now, the Channel Tunnel rail link, not, of course, it was going to happen, but to have a station, an international station, at Stratford. And this is 93, we commissioned Victor Hausner with the local boroughs to do an economic benefit study of what would happen if you had an international station there at Stratford. We got the northern authorities to agree with us, and that actually produced, it said, reinvent London. Manufacturing's gone, the port's gone, reinvent it with these big development sites here. I can say more later. And so that was, no, I'll say it's very little. Okay. That is, of course, I don't know who did this, but anyway, I quite like it. You're going to see Orby Rail later. But the London Orbital, which then became for us the Orby Rail, now we really pushed this, LPAC pushed this, and it was joining up the suburban stations right round London. But it just needed a bit of track here, a bit of track there, and nobody went right round London, but it joined the north, south, east and west. And we argued a lot for west. They never got, the transport planners never got the projections right. They always, and they never look at latent demand. But anyway, enough of that. We then had to really argue for it when we got into London government. And I must say, it was hard fought getting in the transport strategy, but it's there and it's doing well as the London Overground. Last bit now, we then get ourselves into London government. And before London government came in, you had a Labour government in '97, which of course said we were going to have a London government. And LPAC started researching and putting together a legacy for whoever was mayor, whoever he or she was going to be. And we worked with all the candidates and we gave them this, our endowment strategy. There was another legacy, of course, which is that LPAC's staff, London Planning Advisory staff, and many of their consultants were then absorbed, lock, stock and barrel, into the new government, which was set up in 2000. Now, here's the slide of the London plan, and that was bringing together everything that we'd been talking about. It was the first fully fledged spatial strategy that London had. And here's the next slide, which is the key diagram, which Isabel showed. It of course absorbs a lot of the thinking of LPAC and takes it further, and it's made possible by the one missing ingredient, that you have a strategic authority with a directly elected mayor who's able to partly direct but mainly coordinate and pull together all the actors for its implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicky. Okay, I'm going to make a management decision and give us about 10 or 12 minutes. The coffee won't go cold. I'm sure we can eat a quicker lunch to make up for this. I think we've got pretty clear pictures here from New York, the failure to create an effective lobby or governance structure to push through the kind of transport developments linked to land developments that might otherwise have been the case. And in London, there's despite a relatively similar history up to this rather odd business of abolishing the citywide government in London in 1986, but the vacuum that was created then in London, leading to an extraordinary ferment of ideas, lobbies, and production of documents. I have personally box files of documents produced at the time, thinking about the future of the city. Perversely, the abolition of its government made lots of good government organisations think hard about what should happen next, and eventually many of these ideas were picked up when citywide government was recreated in 2000. But can I just ask Geoffrey and David, as I was going to earlier on, am I right in this assessment about the failure for there to be a consistent, Regional Plan Association notwithstanding, but a consistent lobby over time for the kind of developments that might have occurred in New York if anything like these London changes had occurred?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the picture I tried to paint, someone referred to it when I gave this presentation yesterday as a pessimistic one, and my response was, it might be pessimistic, but it's realistic. There's been again, notwithstanding all the great stuff that RPA has done, and our president is in the audience, and I would hasten to add that I think we've done some great things, but over this long period, starting particularly in the last generation, or I should say even before, there's been a failure. There's been a failure for a variety of reasons, and I try to, by suggesting what some of the remedies might be, what the reasons for those failures were. And I come back to the funding issue. Until we solve that, we're not going to be able to be dealing with some of these ideas that you use the word that you've used, ferment, that should be fermented and then created out of that ferment. Because I think there's tremendous things that we can do to unlock development in the New York region, and we're missing the boat. We missed the boat in the past, and we're missing the boat now unless we can we change things.
And is the fact that the political or the agency, the MTA, that's more than any other responsible, is a state agency with its heart partly in Albany, an issue here? Is that should I read that into this?
Well, it goes beyond that. The MTA is a state agency, but the New York region encompasses 3 states.
Yeah.
So in New York, the New York region famously has more governments per capita than any other region in the country. Not just limited to transport and land use, but there are a lot of actors involved in the process. And if we think about, we're talking a lot about the growth of the city, and we've talked about 1 million people are expected to move into the city. There's 3 million people expected to move into the suburban areas surrounding the city. And most of the job growth is going to occur outside of the city. And even within the city, most of the job growth is going to occur in the outer boroughs, as the current projections go. So we have a government structure from the state to the city to the region to the neighborhood that's not very well equipped to deal with regional problems of allocation. Where should we be? Say we are going to expand the system. Where are we going to expand it? Are we going to expand it so that it touches the most districts of elected officials, which is typically the way we do things in the U.S.? Or are we going to invest in the system where it would do the most good for commercial development, residential development, and travel?
And I know that the RPA does this exactly what I'm about to describe, but the sense that Nicky Gavron described in London, which came about, as I said, because of this random act of the abolition of the citywide authority, but of the coming together of a grand coalition, effectively, of organisations like the RPA and business and others getting behind a long-term plan. Has that idea, simple though it sounds, I don't want to, it's a genuine question based on ignorance, has that kind of got traction?
It's got traction, but it's not enough. We're about to launch our 4th plan, and that will hopefully be bringing people together from business, from labor, from environmental advocacy groups, and so on, around a strategic plan of what we're going to do about our transportation system, our land use changes, a whole series of other things. We can do the greatest plan in the world, but as long as we have a government structure that is not in tune, and I think that Stephen's point, which I've made many times myself, is that New York is not the capital of the United States. London is the center of Britain.
Yeah.
And that makes a great deal of difference. And so we've got to overcome that. We've got to figure out a structure to overcome that so we can be in control of the choices that we make. And we will probably always rely to some degree on the feds, but we can't depend upon them.
Okay. Let's open the question. Is there anybody, Nicky, I'll come back to you at the end.
I just wanted to ask him a question.
All right, well, you can ask your question at the end. Right. Anybody like to ask a question from the audience or make a point, short and sharp? Could you just roughly say, go to the mic and say who you are? Yeah.
Sure. I actually intern with HUD right now, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I'm coming from Washington, D.C. today. And I think that you're making a lot of good points, and that London's definitely seized a lot of excellent opportunities, in a more polycentric model, and that in New York, if it's fair to say, we've missed out on a lot of those. And so I am wondering how you would propose a different government structure in more tangible terms. What could we do? I mean, we've discussed a lot about what the issues are, but what sorts of solutions would you propose so that we can better coordinate in more holistic terms and in more practical terms?
That's brilliant. I mean, I was going to ask what kind of government system can we imagine a reform of New York government? That may be playing games beyond fantasy, but it's a good. I was thinking the same myself. One other question. Can we take one more thought or question?
Yes.
Nope. Oh, Nicky.
Nicky.
Well, Nicky's got a question. Nicky, you asked the question you were going to ask. Short and sharp.
No, I won't. I'll leave it now because I think we should deal with this.
Okay, well, let's take this governance question. I mean, how imagine? I mean, let's put it this way: if nothing, I'm not saying it can't, but if nothing can change till the government or governance arrangements change, is there a lobby to do that, or is that just an unimaginable thing to do?
I think Jeffrey's point about value capture is exactly right, that we need to connect the finance to the development much more strongly, where the financing is divorced from the investment right now. And so the investment choices are being made not based on land use changes or local changes. But when we're talking about transit investment, we're talking about very localized effects. You either are near the system and you can use it, or you're not near the system and you can't use it. And it makes a lot of sense to tie the financing in much more locally. And I think as you do that, you'll improve the governance structure just through that process. I also think from a federal level, housing and urban development used to have a much stronger role in federal transit policy than they do now. In the 60s, it was transit investment was run through HUD. It's not, and this is speculation on my part, but it's not obvious to me why HUD should not be in charge of U.S. federal transit policy. We want housing and urban development connected to transit investment. So why does our housing and urban development not control the transit investment? And I think that's an open question to discuss.
I mean, the other thing, I'm perhaps bringing Stephen on this. I mean, however, I mean, you know, we heard earlier that the number 7 line, the Flushing line, is being extended partly on the basis of tax revenues generated, and the Battersea extension of the Northern line is following that model. But these things are not easy to put together, are they? I mean, unless there isn't a pre-existing arrangement to bring together the government, whatever the government is, and developers, and this sort of iterative process means it can be very complicated to get these things to work. Is that right, Stephen? Yeah,
it is. It's perhaps worth mentioning, because nobody else has, the really, from our point of view, innovative way Crossrail has been funded. Roughly, I think, about 1/3 of grant from national government, but 1/3 of it from a new supplementary tax on the business rate across the piece.
That's the business property tax.
Yeah, business property tax, thank you. Across the piece, across the whole of London, in other words. It's not attempting to extract value from the specific properties who particularly benefit from this. It's recognising there's a bit of rough justice here. Yeah. And it's all very difficult to be precise, but there is a way of capturing some of the incremental value and then ring-fencing it to pay for the capital cost. And that, I think, is something very new in our way of thinking. The issue is how often you can repeat that. Having done it once, can you keep on doing it for the other bits of infrastructure you'd want to do, like Crossrail 2, for example? Yeah. And I think probably you'll run out of steam fairly soon. But the point is, it's a partnership between central government and the local tax base. You can't do it all on central government. You can't do it all on the local tax base because it's just too complicated. You can do it, perhaps, if you can do half and half.
This underscores, I think, the role of business. And I'm interested in whether there is the equivalent of a New York City partnership outside of New York. I mean, surely there should be a big partnership across the state and wider. Because I have to say, in London, Crossrail, as much as anything, happened because the business community were really pushing it. Congestion charging happened because, although local authorities wanted it, the business community took it to government. And the role of business, making the lobbying. So we did a document. The London Plan was, in a sense, it was an infrastructure investment bidding document. It eventually got Ken his rail renaissance, but not till 2004.
Ken is the previous mayor, by the way. Yes. Ken Livingstone, the previous mayor. Yeah. Jeffrey.
Well, I'm very cognizant of the time. We're going to get kicked off very quickly. I'll make one point. The value capture is good, and just remembering we've got to fix the existing system, improve the existing system, and value capture can be helpful with expansion projects. We won't get to the expansion projects unless we get to funding. We won't get to funding unless we change the governance.
Okay, that's a good point to end. Well, a good bad point to end, but you know what I mean. It's a nice sharp point to end. So, Nicky, Jeffrey, David. Stephen, thank you very much. We've eaten into and indeed consumed the entire coffee break, for which I apologise, my fault entirely.